May 1879. The halls of the Geographical Society in Paris are packed to capacity. The air is thick with cigar smoke and absolute confidence. Standing before the international delegates is Ferdinand de Lesseps, the 74-year-old visionary who, a decade earlier, had successfully sliced through the Egyptian desert to create the Suez Canal. He is not an engineer, he is a former diplomat, a masterful promoter, and a man accustomed to bending governments to his will. Now, he points his cane at a massive map of the Central American Isthmus. He declares that the time has come to sever North and South America, uniting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. His decree is absolute. The canal through Panama will be built, and it will be constructed strictly at sea level. Before we examine the specific blueprints that set this institutional failure in motion, if you want to keep exploring the unvarnished engineering records of history's most ambitious infrastructure projects, subscribe to the channel and join our community of historical analysts. The proposition Lesseps presented in Paris that spring contained a glaring, fundamental flaw. A sea-level canal is exactly what it sounds like. A flat ditch dug deep enough to allow ocean water to flow freely from one side to the other, requiring no locks to raise or lower the ships. At Suez, this approach made logistical sense. The Egyptian desert was a flat, dry expanse of sand situated precisely at the elevation of the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Engineers simply had to dredge a shallow trench across a predictable, arid landscape. Panama was an entirely different geological entity. The isthmus is 50 miles of dense, mountainous tropical jungle resting on a volatile foundation of volcanic rock, unstable clay, and deep swamps. To create a sea-level passage, the French would have to cut a continuous trench straight through the continental divide, a mountainous spine peaking at over 300 feet above sea level at a location known as the Culebra Cut. Furthermore, Panama receives more than 100 inches of rain annually. Engineers looking at these raw figures immediately recognize the core logistical paradox. You cannot simply dig a vertical trench through 300 feet of saturated, unstable clay to prevent the walls from collapsing under their own weight. The angle of the slopes would have to be pushed back so far that the sheer volume of excavated earth would reach mathematically impossible numbers. Yet, Lesseps willfully ignored this reality. When the technical committee at the Congress of 1879 convened to assess the logistics, experienced field engineers raised the alarm. Adolphe Gaudin de Lepinay, a brilliant French engineer who had actually supervised construction projects in tropical environments, stood up and presented a radically different plan. He argued that a sea-level canal in Panama was an engineering impossibility. Instead, he proposed building massive dams on the Hubris River to create an artificial lake in the center of the isthmus, using a series of mechanical locks to lift ships up to the lake and bring them back down on the other side. This design would drastically reduce the amount of required excavation and manage the erratic flooding of the tropical rivers. Lesseps refused to listen. He actively marginalized de Lepinay and stacked the technical subcommittees with loyalists, politicians, and speculators who possessed zero structural engineering background. Through sheer charisma and backroom pressure, Lesseps bullied the Congress into officially endorsing his sea-level plan. What followed was one of the most aggressive and misleading corporate public relations campaigns of the 19th century. To fund this monumental impossibility, Lesseps launched a massive public subscription campaign across France. His target was not just wealthy bankers, but the French middle class, shopkeepers, teachers, and factory workers. He founded a dedicated publication, the Bulletin du Canal Interoceanique, which served as a direct propaganda organ for the canal company. If you read the archival copies of the bulletin today, the disconnect from geological reality is staggering. The company printed heavily falsified geological surveys, suggesting the Panamanian rock was solid and easily extracted. They projected wildly optimistic excavation costs and guaranteed completion within 12 years. Lesseps utilized his immense national prestige from the Suez Triumph to assure the public that the mountains of Panama would yield to French industry, just as the sands of Egypt had. Driven by this reckless corporate ambition, hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens handed over their life savings to purchase shares. By early 1881, the company had amassed millions of francs, establishing a colossal financial pipeline based entirely on a geographical fiction. With the capital secured, the physical operation commenced. In the early months of 1881, the first ships arrived at the coastal town of Colon on the Atlantic side of the isthmus. They deposited thousands of unsuspecting laborers, drawn primarily from Jamaica and surrounding Caribbean islands, alongside an initial wave of French engineers and administrators. The ships also unloaded heavy mechanical equipment. The French relied heavily on the technology that had conquered Suez. Stevedores maneuvered massive iron dredges onto the mud-slick shores, unloading heavy Couvreux steam excavators and fleets of European tipping wagons. These excavators were essentially land-based bucket dredges, designed to run on parallel iron tracks. A long mechanical arm extended from the main chassis, dragging a continuous chain of metal buckets across the soil, scooping up earth and dumping it into waiting rail cars. In the dry, stable soil of a European railway cut, a Couvreux excavator was an industrial marvel. In the supersaturated, unpredictable topography of Panama, it was structurally inadequate. When the French engineers stepped off the docks and surveyed the initial staging grounds, the immediate physical reality of the jungle began to assert itself. There was no infrastructure. There were no deepwater ports capable of handling the incoming cargo traffic, no heavy-duty rail lines to transport the excavators inland to the Continental Divide, and no adequate housing for the thousands of men pouring off the ships. The terrain itself was incredibly hostile. The ground around Colon was an expansive, festering tidal swamp, where the mud was so deep and slick that the heavy iron machinery simply sank under its own weight before it could even be properly assembled. To execute the sea-level plan, the engineers knew they had to follow the path of the Chagres River into the interior mountains. But looking at the river in person, the true scale of Lesseps' geographical ignorance became undeniable. During the intense tropical storms of the rainy season, the Chagres could rise more than 30 feet in a matter of hours. Because a sea-level canal would sit entirely at the elevation of the oceans, there would be no locks or dams to control the water. Any major surge from the Hubris would act like a massive, uncontained fire hose, dumping millions of gallons of water and heavy tropical debris directly into the navigation trench, instantly wiping out the channel. Yet, the directives from the boardroom in Paris remained absolute. Excavation had to begin immediately to maintain the illusion of progress for the volatile shareholders back home. The engineers were forced to send the labor crews straight into the dense brush with machetes and hand shovels to begin clearing the route, tasked with carving a perfectly flat line through an environment that actively defied every principle of European construction. The first iron buckets began to scrape against the wet Panamanian earth. The men sweating in the humid, oppressive air of the isthmus were completely unaware that the initial surveys they were executing had been mathematically compromised from the start. They were attempting to move a mountain range, using equipment meant for flatlands, funded by a corporate machine that actively suppressed any reports of structural doubt. As the mechanical excavators were slowly pushed deeper into the jungle toward the imposing shadow of the Culebra Cut, a terrifying logistical question loomed over the entire operation. How long could the flamboyant promotional materials printed in Paris hide the fact that the company was ordering its men to manually dismantle an entire mountain range that was already beginning to fight back? The handwritten payroll and excavation ledgers from the winter of 1882 survive in the French National Archives, and their pages document a catastrophic breakdown in basic physics. Contractors were paid by the cubic yard, their daily quotas recorded in neat, meticulous columns to be sent back to the corporate directors. But looking closely at the dates and the extraction volumes from the central mountains, a bizarre pattern emerges. The exact same sections of earth were being excavated, measured, and billed for multiple times in the span of a single month. The laborers were not committing financial fraud. They were simply trying to dig a rigid trench through a substance that refused to stay in place. The engineers attempting to carve through the Continental Divide had encountered a specific geological layer that modern soil specialists refer to as the Cucaracha Formation. During the short Panamanian dry season, this material appeared to be a relatively stable, loosely consolidated shale and clay. The French engineers, relying entirely on their prior experience with European railway construction and the arid sands of Suez, calculated the necessary slope angles based on this dry state. They assumed they could carve steep, aggressive walls down into the valley, utilizing a standard 1-to-1 slope ratio to minimize the total volume of earth they had to remove. Then the wet season arrived. Panama is subjected to intense, relentless tropical downpours, absorbing over 100 inches of rainfall annually. When the water hit the exposed Cucaracha Formation, the clay underwent a radical molecular shift. It did not simply become muddy, it liquefied. The earth transformed into a highly viscous, heavy slurry with absolutely zero shear strength. When the heavy rains saturated the steep valley walls, The sheer weight of the waterlogged soil exceeded the internal friction holding the slope together. Without warning, millions of tons of earth would detach. Massive slope failures caused the mountain to flow downhill directly into the newly excavated canal prism. Entire sections of the trench that had taken 1,000 men 3 months to dig would be completely filled back in during a single afternoon of rain. The heavy iron tracks, the rail cars, and the mechanical equipment were swept away and buried under 40 feet of wet clay. The contractors found themselves trapped in a terrifying Sisyphean loop. They were ordered to dig a hole, the mountain filled it back in, and they were forced to dig out the exact same mud all over again just to retrieve their submerged machinery. The European mechanical equipment deployed to mitigate this disaster proved completely fundamentally inadequate for the tropical environment. The continuous bucket chain excavators, which had functioned perfectly when dredging the loose, dry sand of Egypt, were rendered useless by the Panamanian clay. The highly adhesive mud stuck firmly to the inside of the iron buckets. As the massive mechanical chain rotated over the top chassis to dump the payload into the waiting rail cars, the clay remained wedged inside the metal scoops. The heavy machinery had to be stopped every few minutes. Laborers armed with metal scrapers and hand shovels had to climb up the iron framework and manually pry the heavy slurry out of every single bucket. The logistical systems designed to transport the excavated spoil away from the digging site experienced a similar structural collapse. The French relied heavily on 040 Decaville locomotives, pulling small, two-axle European tipping wagons. These railcars were engineered for light gravel and stable, level tracks. When loaded with massive, jagged chunks of volcanic basalt blasted from the deeper layers of the cut, the wooden frames of the wagons routinely splintered, and the axles snapped under the concentrated weight. Furthermore, the mechanics of track shifting in a swamp destroy the operational timeline. Every time a steam excavator advanced along the trench, the parallel iron rails had to be physically unspiked, shifted over, and respiked to keep the dumping wagons aligned with the machine. In a dry European cut, a small track gang could accomplish this in an hour. In the supersaturated mud of the isthmus, the heavy wooden timber ties immediately sank out of sight. It required hundreds of men using long iron pry bars, standing waist deep in acidic mud, straining to lift the heavy iron rails out of the suction of the clay. Because the tracks could never be properly ballasted on solid ground, the locomotives derailed constantly. A single derailed 040 Decaville engine would bottleneck the entire extraction line, forcing hundreds of men to sit idle while heavy winches were deployed to drag the locomotive back onto the warped tracks. Because the heavily promoted machines were failing, the burden of excavation fell entirely on the manual labor force. Thousands of workers, primarily recruited from Jamaica and the surrounding Caribbean islands, were thrown into the flooded pits. They swung heavy iron pickaxes into volcanic rock that defied standard extraction methods. The deeper basalt layers required intense blasting. The foremen used black powder and early forms of dynamite, but the unpredictable, heavily fractured geology of the volcanic rock meant that explosive charges often blew out sideways through hidden fissures, failing to fracture the intended target while sending lethal shrapnel tearing through the crowded work zones. The shattered rock then had to be loaded by hand into wheelbarrows and pushed up wet, slippery planks out of the excavation zone. Back in the Paris boardroom, Ferdinand de Lesseps and his executive committee faced a rapidly accelerating financial disaster. The operational burn rate was staggering. The cost per cubic yard of excavated earth was spiraling wildly beyond the initial projections presented to the French public. To maintain the illusion of the sea-level design and keep the public subscription money flowing from the middle-class investors, the directors authorized drastic administrative maneuvers. They instituted a policy of extreme compartmentalization. Instead of allowing a single prime contractor to manage the entire route and thus perceive the total structural failure, the canal company divided the 50-mile isthmus into dozens of smaller, isolated subcontracts. No single field engineer on the ground could see the macro scale of the delay. Only the central office in Paris held the master ledger. When a subcontractor inevitably failed to meet their mathematically impossible excavation quotas due to landslides and equipment failure, the company simply terminated their contract. The boardroom would then publicly blame the specific contractor's supposed incompetence for the delay, rather than admitting the fundamental geographical impossibility of the task. To appease the volatile shareholders, the canal company's propaganda arm, the Bulletin du Canal Interoceanique, aggressively manipulated the definition of progress. The heavily curated reports distributed across France highlighted the raw number of new machines unloaded at the docks and the vast total acreage of jungle canopy cleared by the machete crews. They celebrated the construction of worker barracks and the laying of telegraph wires. They carefully omitted the critical engineering metric. The actual vertical depth of the central canal channel was barely changing. The shareholders were reading glowing reports of massive earth-moving operations, entirely unaware that the earth being moved was the exact same mud sliding back into the trench week after week. The pressure from Paris to increase output pushed the field supervisors to abandon standard safety protocols and extend labor shifts into the punishing heat of the tropical afternoon. The physical exhaustion of the workforce in the flooded, unstable trenches was reaching critical limits. The men were operating at the absolute edge of human endurance, burning calories at a rate that their inadequate camp rations could not replace, while sleeping in damp, crowded barracks with little ventilation. But the relentless rainfall and the deep mud were about to trigger a completely different kind of operational collapse. The constant downpours left millions of gallons of stagnant water pooling in the newly excavated trenches, inside the abandoned wheelbarrows, and inside the metal chassis of the idle steam excavators. The financial ledgers in Europe could easily be manipulated by reassigning costs and firing contractors. But in the medical tents along the banks of the Chagres River, the hospital intake registers were beginning to record an anomaly. Men were not just suffering from exhaustion or industrial accidents. They were running violent fevers, their skin turning yellow and failing to report for their shifts entirely. A biological surge was quietly breeding in the stagnant water of the work camps, preparing to strike a blow that would threaten to leave the entire corporate enterprise without a living workforce to hold the shovels. On the slopes of Ancon Hill overlooking Panama City, a massive 5 million franc medical complex opened its doors in 1882. L'Hôpital Central de Panama was an architectural achievement meant to project supreme colonial competence to the Parisian investors funding the canal. The complex consisted of 50 individual pavilions, sprawling verandas designed to catch the Pacific breeze, and pristine surgical wards staffed by the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul. From the ocean, it looked like a triumph of French administrative power. In practice, it was a finely tuned biological trap. The hospital designers had prioritized European aesthetics and traditional ward layouts, entirely unaware of the specific mechanics of tropical disease transmission. The pristine pavilions were surrounded by meticulously maintained lush botanical gardens. To protect the incapacitated patients from the relentless columns of leaf-cutter ants and other crawling insects, the architects implemented a standard colonial mitigation strategy. Every single iron bedpost in the open-air wards was placed inside a small ceramic basin filled with stagnant water. They essentially built a tiny moat around every patient. This singular architectural decision triggered an unparalleled workforce depletion. At the time, the scientific consensus in Europe dictated that yellow fever and malaria were caused by miasma, toxic vapors emanating from the rotting vegetation and marshlands of the jungle. The French administration believed that elevating the hospital on Ancon Hill away from the swamp gases would protect the patients. They did not know that a specific species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti, was the true vector for yellow fever. This insect does not breed in the large, flowing rivers or the deep, muddy swamps. It requires small, undisturbed pools of clear, stagnant water to lay its eggs. By placing 4 water-filled ceramic basins under hundreds of beds across 50 pavilions, the French engineers unwittingly constructed a hyper-efficient mechanized incubation system for the precise insect transmitting the contagion. A laborer who contracted a mild fever in the Calabre cut would be placed on a train and sent to the central hospital for observation. Once in the ward, local mosquitoes breeding directly under his own bed would bite him, acquire the pathogen, and immediately carry it to the adjacent beds, infecting administrators, engineers, and previously healthy patients recovering from minor industrial accidents. The biological behavior of this specific insect compounded the crisis. Unlike other species that travel long distances from expansive marshes, this vector thrives in highly concentrated human settlements, flying only short distances from its breeding pool. By clustering the workforce into dense, poorly ventilated barracks, and subsequently moving the incapacitated men into an open-air hospital teeming with artificial breeding grounds, the company engineered a perfectly closed transmission loop. The environment was optimized for maximum biological efficiency. As the wet season intensified, yellow fever and malaria swept through the work camps along the Chagres River. The workforce began evaporating. The financial ledgers in Paris were already buckling under the weight of the massive excavation failures, but the biological reality on the ground presented an entirely different kind of systemic collapse. Ferdinand de Lesseps and his executive committee faced an impossible administrative paradox. The canal company's entire cash flow relied on a continuous pipeline of public subscription money from middle-class French citizens. If the true attrition rate of the workforce became public knowledge, that financial pipeline would freeze instantly. No investor would buy shares in a project where the labor force was succumbing to the environment faster than they could be replaced. The institutional response was a mandate of severe systematic categorization fraud. The boardroom prioritized financial optics over medical realities, forcing the field administrators to actively falsify the casualty reports sent back to Europe. Look closely at the surviving company payroll archives from 1883 and 1884. You will find a deliberate administrative bottleneck designed to mathematically hide the losses. The official ledgers wiped men who did not survive from the primary registers, reclassifying their absences under vague administrative codes. The medical officers were instructed to record a fatal outcome as yellow fever only if the patient exhibited a very narrow, late-stage set of symptoms before they succumbed. Hundreds of laborers who clearly contracted the illness were instead logged as suffering from general tropical malaise, nervous exhaustion, or kidney ailments. To further suppress the official numbers, the canal company instituted a strict financial barrier for entry into L'Hôpital Central. While high-ranking French engineers and administrators were admitted freely, manual laborers, primarily Jamaican and West Indian men, were required to pay an exorbitant daily fee for treatment. The vast majority of the manual workforce could not afford this cost. The administrative mandate required a daily deduction from a laborer's wages for every day spent in a hospital bed. Because the Caribbean laborers were paid mere fractions of what the European engineers earned, a week in the hospital would entirely erase months of savings. Faced with this mathematical reality, men actively hid their symptoms, while they forced themselves to stand in the mud, gripping pickaxes while running high fevers, terrified that a medical diagnosis would bankrupt them. They relied on traditional herbal remedies smuggled into the camps, staying out of the official medical system until they simply collapsed on the tracks. By keeping the sickest laborers out of the primary medical facilities, the company kept them off the central hospital registers. The official attrition rates mailed back to the shareholders in Paris only reflected the select few who made it to Ancon Hill. The true burden fell entirely on the invisible workforce in the remote excavation sectors, whose losses were documented only by local foremen scribbling tallies on scrap paper. The financial mechanics of the labor contracts further obscured the reality on the ground. The canal company relied on a massive network of independent labor brokers who recruited men from the islands. These brokers were paid based on the total volume of earth their crews removed from the trench, not on the daily head count of their laborers. When a 20-man crew was reduced to 10 overnight due to illness, the broker still faced the same excavation quota. To avoid losing their corporate bonuses, the foreman forced the remaining healthy men to work double shifts in the flooded trenches, pushing them past the limits of human endurance. Because the human infrastructure was failing, the mechanical infrastructure stalled entirely. The massive iron Couvreau steam excavators and the 040 locomotives required constant maintenance, lubrication, and highly coordinated crews to operate safely on the unstable clay. As the experienced engineers and specialized mechanics were moved to the medical pavilions, there was no one left to run the machinery. Millions of francs worth of heavy industrial equipment was simply left parked on the sinking rail lines. The relentless rain oxidized the iron, fusing the gears and rusting the bucket chains into rigid, immovable monuments of corporate failure. The sheer volume of material required to manage the mounting crisis began to betray the official narrative. The central purchasing orders from 1884 reveal a massive spike in requisitions for imported pine timber. The French public was told this wood was intended for reinforcing the railway trestles and expanding the worker housing. In reality, carpenters on the isthmus were running a continuous assembly line, cutting the imported wood into unpainted burial boxes. The disconnect between the glowing progress reports published in the Bulletin du Canal Interoceanique and the rapid evaporation of the workforce became too immense to contain. Independent engineers and junior medical officers, realizing the administration was willfully leading thousands of men into an environmental hazard, began keeping their own private notebooks. They carefully tallied the empty bunks in the Culebra-cut barracks and compared them against the fraudulent numbers printed in the company newsletter. Smuggling this data back to Europe required bypassing the company's aggressive internal mail sensors. Field managers loyal to Lesseps routinely intercepted outgoing letters that painted a negative picture of the project. To circumvent this, whistleblowers inside the medical tents quietly handed their private ledgers directly to sympathetic merchant ship captains bound for independent ports. When these unauthorized accounts slowly began to circulate in the French press, the canal company responded with an aggressive counter-campaign. They paid exorbitant bribes to prominent Parisian journalists to publish fabricated retractions, dismissing the high attrition rates as the malicious rumors of rival American rail conglomerates. Lesseps himself toured the French provinces, leveraging his formidable charisma to assure the public that the biological threats were completely under control and that the sea-level trench was progressing exactly on schedule. But the physical reality of the isthmus could no longer be managed with public relations. The extraction quotas were fundamentally impossible. The heavy iron steam excavators were sinking into the liquefied clay of the Continental Divide faster than the tracks could be laid. The workforce was exhausted, depleted, and operating on fractured supply lines. The continuous rains of the wet season were entirely washing away whatever small progress the manual crews managed to carve out of the mud. By 1885, the company had burned through its initial capital reserves. The sea-level design was a proven engineering fiction, yet the corporate leadership stubbornly refused to alter the blueprint, knowing that admitting the flaw would trigger a massive shareholder panic. They continued to throw fresh recruits and heavy machinery into an environment that simply consumed them. The operational deficit grew to a scale that threatened to bankrupt not just the company, but the hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens who had staked their life savings on the venture. The executive board in Paris was out of time, out of money, and finally out of illusions. The supreme arrogance that had launched the sea-level canal was fractured by the undeniable physics of the Panamanian jungle. To salvage the enterprise, Lesseps realized he had to abandon his original mandate and build a system of locks to cross the mountains. But redesigning the entire canal mid-construction required a staggering infusion of fresh capital, money that the standard banking institutions outright refused to lend. The company needed a financial maneuver so bold it would require the authorization of the highest levels of the French government, setting the stage for a desperate fiscal scheme that would ultimately unravel into one of the largest corporate scandals of the century. On the Rue de Chateaudun in Paris, the heavy oak doors of Gustave Eiffel's engineering firm opened to receive an emergency commission in the winter of 1887. Eiffel, fresh from engineering, the internal structural framework of the Statue of Liberty, and actively organizing the construction of his massive iron tower for the upcoming Universal Exposition, was presented with a frantic request from the corporate directors of the Panama Canal Company. Ferdinand de Lesseps had finally folded. The relentless landslides in the Culebra Cut and the complete exhaustion of the manual labor force had forced him to officially abandon the sea-level trench. He needed Eiffel to immediately draft a system of mechanical locks to lift ocean vessels over the Continental Divide. The structural mechanics Eiffel proposed were an exercise in extreme industrial scaling. He approached the geographical obstacle with strict mathematical precision, recognizing that traditional masonry locks built from heavy stone would simply sink into the supersaturated Panamanian clay. Instead, Eiffel designed an intricate system of 8 massive lock chambers, 4 positioned on each slope of the mountains. To solve the foundational instability of the soil, he engineered the lock chambers as colossal iron caissons, essentially hollow steel boxes that could be floated into position, grounded in excavated pits, and then filled with concrete and iron ballast to create a rigid, unified structure. The gates themselves were an engineering departure from standard maritime design. Traditional swinging miter gates, like those used on smaller European canals, could not withstand the immense hydraulic pressure of holding back 30 feet of water while spanning a width capable of accommodating a 10,000-ton ocean liner. Eiffel designed massive, rolling iron gates that would retract sideways into deep recesses built into the lock walls. These gates were to be operated by a complex network of high-pressure hydraulic accumulators, powered by steam-driven pumps drawing water directly from the Hubris River. The logistical requirements to execute this blueprint were staggering. The iron components had to be cast in European foundries, loaded onto cargo ships, transported across the Atlantic, and unloaded onto the mud-slicked shores of Cologne. From there, they had to be transported inland on a railway system that was already fracturing under the weight of standard excavation equipment. Implementing this radical design pivot in a flooded tropical ravine required a massive infusion of fresh capital. The canal company had none. By late 1887, the internal ledgers were entirely hollow. The corporate burn rate had vastly exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. The company had spent years paying artificial dividends to early shareholders out of the capital raised from new investors, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme profitability. Standard financial institutions took one look at Eiffel's revised lock plans, compared the raw material costs against the severe labor attrition rates in the field, and firmly locked their vaults. The established bond markets flatly refused to underwrite the new phase of construction. The executive board realized the only remaining source of capital large enough to salvage the lock system was the collective savings of the French public, leveraged through a government-sanctioned national lottery. Under French law, authorizing a lottery bond issue of this magnitude required a formal act of Parliament. The canal company needed the political establishment to vote in favor of the measure, and they needed the national press to enthusiastically market the new bonds to the public. They possessed no legitimate financial metrics to persuade either group. They resorted to purchasing the consensus directly. Examine the surviving bank records and parliamentary investigations from the period, and the architecture of the operation becomes clear. The canal company established a massive off-the-books slush fund placed under the control of a prominent financier named Jacques de Reynac. The strategy was aggressively transactional. Reynac set up a sprawling network of dummy corporations and intermediary accounts to filter millions of francs out of the canal company's remaining reserves. He moved first on the French press. A syndicate was organized to distribute heavy cash payments to prominent journalists, editors, and independent newspaper owners. The financial press, which should have been fiercely scrutinizing the mathematical impossibility of building Eiffel's massive iron locks with an incapacitated workforce, suddenly fell entirely silent on the logistical realities. Instead, they published heavily curated editorials praising the lock system as the final, guaranteed solution. They printed fabricated schedules suggesting the new iron components were already being assembled in the jungle, assuring readers that the temporary delay was merely a minor engineering adjustment. But manipulating the press was only half the equation. Reynac moved his operation into the halls of the Chamber of Deputies. Using a network of discreet fixers, he distributed heavy envelopes of cash and promised future corporate board seats to government ministers, parliamentary deputies, and the chairman of vital regulatory committees. Men who had previously expressed severe, documented doubts about the canal's viability suddenly stood at the parliamentary podium and delivered impassioned speeches. They argued that the pride of French industry was at stake, demanding the government support the national enterprise and authorize the lottery. The operation was highly effective. In June 1888, Parliament formally authorized the issuance of 2 million lottery bonds. The mechanics of the offering were deeply predatory. Ordinary citizens, primarily rural farmers, school teachers, and small shopkeepers, were heavily targeted by the compromised press. They were encouraged to buy bonds to fund the new locks, with the added enticement that a select number of those bonds would be drawn randomly for massive cash prizes. The promotional materials distributed across the country actively suppressed any mention of the flooded excavation trenches, the heavy losses among the labor crews, or the abandoned machinery rusting in the jungle. This phantom capital was injected into an engineering void. The funds raised by the lottery vanished almost immediately. A massive percentage was instantly swallowed by compounding interest payments on older debts and the exorbitant overhead of the bribery network itself. What little money remained was rapidly consumed by the raw logistical friction of trying to pivot a failing 50-mile construction site from a sea-level trench to an elevated lock system. On the ground in Panama, the physical breakdown accelerated beyond administrative control. The Caribbean laborers, who had endured the impossible quotas and the biological hazards of the tropical earthwork, suddenly stopped receiving their wages. The company could no longer afford to pay the independent labor brokers. When the payroll shipments failed to arrive at the coastal camps, the manual workforce simply dropped their heavy iron pickaxes and walked away from the mud. Without human infrastructure, the mechanical supply lines severed instantly. Shipments of imported coal required to power the 040 Decauville locomotives were left sitting on the docks. The heavy iron buckets of the Couvreux steam excavators froze in place deep inside the Culebra Cut. The relentless tropical rains poured into the unfinished trenches, submerging the massive iron wheels of the abandoned rail cars. The deep mud swallowed the wooden ties of the transport tracks, permanently locking millions of francs worth of heavy industrial machinery into the liquefied clay. The mathematics of the situation finally overpowered the corporate facade. By December 14, 1888, the Central Reserves hit zero. The Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique officially suspended payment on its debts. The executive board filed for bankruptcy, plunging the entire enterprise into liquidation. The manual digging stopped, and the jungle immediately began to reclaim the fractured geography. But the legal and social fallout was only just beginning to detonate across Europe. As the full scale of the phantom capital, the falsified medical ledgers, and the parliamentary bribery began to slowly leak out of the sealed archives, the French public demanded accountability for the complete evaporation of 1.5 billion francs. With the central corporate structure destroyed and the original planners scrambling to hide their paper trails, who would the government single out to face the tribunals when the largest financial scandal of the 19th century finally broke open? Inside the stone corridors of the Palais de Justice in Paris, a team of state-appointed magistrates took possession of the remaining Canal Company archives in early 1889. The civil liquidator assigned to manage the bankruptcy expected to find a disorganized but salvageable corporate structure. Instead, as the accounting clerks began pulling the master ledgers from the sealed vaults, they uncovered a massive systemic vacuum. The physical assets on the isthmus, the imported iron rails, the medical pavilions, and the thousands of rusting steam excavators held a liquidation value of roughly 30 million francs. The company's outstanding liabilities, however, approached 2 billion francs. The financial floor completely fell out from under the French middle class. 800,000 individual investors, representing rural farmers, school teachers, and small business owners, realized simultaneously that the decorative paper bonds they held in their lockboxes were entirely worthless. Entire family estates were evaporated overnight. The sheer scale of the vanished capital triggered localized banking panics across the French provinces. But for 3 years, the political establishment managed to keep the exact mechanics of the financial disappearance quietly contained within the liquidation courts, terrified of what the specific receipts would reveal about their own ranks. That containment broke permanently in the autumn of 1892. A fiercely independent nationalist newspaper, La Libre Parole, began publishing a serialized investigation based on leaked bank records. The journalists had acquired the confidential transaction logs of Jacques de Renac's sprawling slush fund. The newspaper printed the names, the dates, and the precise franc amounts distributed to the parliamentary deputies who had authorized the desperate lottery bonds. The resulting political explosion paralyzed the French Republic. Parliament was forced to convene a special investigative committee, dragging high-ranking ministers into public hearings. The daily testimonies laid bare the exact architecture of the cover-up. The public finally learned that the glowing progress reports published in the Bulletin du Canal Interoceanique had been entirely fabricated. The committee entered into evidence the internal engineering assessments that proved the boardroom knew the sea-level trench was physically impossible years before they abandoned it. The true, sanitized medical ledgers were brought to light, exposing how the administration systematically hid the heavy losses among the Caribbean manual workforce to keep the European subscription pipelines open. As the subpoena network tightened, the principal fixers began to disappear. Jacques de Renac, the financier who orchestrated the massive bribery ring, succumbed to a sudden and highly suspicious toxicological event, just hours before he was scheduled to testify, taking the deepest secrets of the slush fund to his grave. By early 1893, the state formally indicted the surviving executive leadership. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the supreme architect of the entire enterprise, was 87 years old and allegedly suffering from severe cognitive decline. He never appeared in court. Instead, his son and primary deputy, Charles de Lesseps, stood in the dock at the court d'assises to answer for the 1.5 billion missing francs. The trial was a highly publicized theater of accountability. The magistrates secured convictions against the Lesseps, Gustave Eiffel, and several prominent politicians, handing down heavy fines and prison sentences. But the legal consequences were an illusion. Within months, the highest appeals court in France quietly overturned the majority of the convictions, ruling that the strict statute of limitations for corporate fraud had expired before the trials even began. The financial masterminds who had knowingly driven thousands of laborers into a hazardous biological trap and stripped the savings of the French working class walked away without serving a single day in confinement. Look closely at the surviving technical blueprints housed in the French National Archives today, and you can strip away the political scandal to examine the raw structural physics of the failure. Modern geotechnical engineers evaluating the 1879 sea level plans confirm a stark reality. The French enterprise was not merely a victim of tropical disease or corporate mismanagement. It was a mathematical impossibility from the moment Ferdinand de Lesseps pointed his cane at the map. To create a flat oceanic trench through the Culebra Cut, the engineers would have needed to excavate down to a depth of nearly 300 feet below the highest peak of the Continental Divide. The fundamental flaw lay in the angle of repose. When the heavy tropical rains saturated the Cucaracha clay formation, the soil lost its internal friction. Modern soil mechanics dictate that to stabilize a slope in those specific geological conditions, the angle of the cut cannot exceed 10 or 15 degrees from the horizontal. If the French had attempted to carve walls at that shallow, stable angle all the way down to sea level, the sheer width of the trench at the top of the mountain would have spanned several miles. The total volume of earth requiring extraction would have multiplied exponentially, exceeding 300 million cubic yards of material. Even with unlimited financial backing and a workforce entirely immune to biological hazards, the 19th century earth-moving technology deployed on the isthmus could not physically extract that volume of material fast enough to outpace the annual rainy seasons. The continuous iron bucket chains of the Couvreux excavators and the light frame 040 Decaville locomotives were fundamentally incompatible with the extreme mass of the required excavation. The sea-level design was an engineering fiction that defied the basic laws of mass and gravity. Back in the Panamanian jungle, the physical remnants of that supreme arrogance were rapidly consumed by the environment. Without the daily intervention of machete crews, the intense biological growth of the tropical canopy reclaimed the cleared zones in a matter of months. Dense vines wrapped around the iron wheels of the tipping wagons, left stranded on the sinking tracks. The immense steel caissons Gustave Eiffel had shipped across the Atlantic to build the emergency lock chambers were abandoned on the riverbanks, oxidizing heavily in the relentless humidity. The Chagres River flooded its banks, washing millions of tons of mud and tropical debris back into the shallow trenches the manual labor force had spent years attempting to clear. The French attempt to divide the Americas left behind a scarred landscape, a shattered national economy, and a pristine medical facility on Ancon Hill that had unwittingly functioned as a biological incubator. The raw paper trail, from the falsified excavation quotas to the manipulated mortality registers, survives as a meticulously documented record of institutional hubris. The ledgers demonstrate precisely what occurs when the physics of the natural world are subordinated to the strict requirements of corporate public relations, leaving a 50-mile trail of rusted iron buried deep in the mud to mark the limits of a single visionary's unchecked ambition.